South Texas immigration lawyer Jessica Cisneros moved one step closer to unseating a veteran congressman. Cisneros once worked as an intern for Democrat Henry Cuellar. Now she'll face her former boss in the May runoff for the Democratic nomination in Congressional District 28. That district stretches from San Antonio all the way down south to the border. Cuellar has held that seat for 17 years. He finished the primary with a slight edge over Cisneros, but Cuellar did not clear the 50% threshold needed to avoid a runoff. Cuellar has faced heat from fellow Democrats over his criticism of the Biden administration's immigration policies. Cuellar's anti-abortion stance led some progressive groups to endorse Cisneros. And there's this. In January, the FBI raided Cuellar's home and campaign headquarters. He denied any wrongdoing. The raid was part of an FBI investigation into alleged ties between a U.S. businessman and the country of Azerbaijan. Cuellar has not been directly linked to the investigation. There is a lot to unpack here. For Insight, we're joined by Julia Manchester, staff writer for The Hill. Julia, you've obviously reported on the FBI raid into Henry Cuellar's home. How much of a difference do you think this made for the primary results that we saw?
You know, Monica, I actually think it made a pretty significant difference because it in a way proves Jessica Cisneros and progressives' point about establishment lawmakers like Henry Cuellar, if there is indeed any wrongdoing or any substance to the investigation that he's involved in. We know that Cisneros and her progressive allies have painted Henry Cuellar as someone who is beholden to special interests and who has ties to outside groups and special interests in Washington and, you know, beyond that. And I think this investigation into Azerbaijan and U.S. businessmen, which somehow involves Cuellar, given that the FBI raided his home and campaign offices, proves the point of his ties to potential ties, I should say, to special interests. It makes him look out of touch. And we've seen the Cisneros campaign really much seize on that point.
Julia, do we think that energy that we saw in that South region for a young progressive candidate like Cisneros, will that carry over into a runoff, which, as you know, usually has super low turnout for voters?
It's a good question, and we know that she's gotten a lot of backing from younger voters in particular. And we know that for younger voters, they don't typically turn out, not only turn out in larger numbers during midterm election years, let alone runoffs. So that will definitely be a challenge the Cisneros campaign will have to tackle. We know that Cuellar's supporters tend to be older, tend to be more, reliable voters. So, he probably doesn't face that same challenge, but I think you're going to see the Cisneros campaign and her progressive allies, which consist of a lot of progressive outside groups in the country, as well as progressive lawmakers on Capitol Hill, very much trying to get the news of this runoff in front of voters in the 28th district.
And to that point, what does it say about Democrats and where they're at that, a lot of progressive groups who typically do not go against incumbents, they put their weight behind Cisneros and did not endorse Cuellar?
I think this primary represents a lot of the tension between more moderate or establishment Democrats and progressive Democrats. So establishment Democrats being someone like Henry Cuellar and a progressive being like Jessica Cisneros. This primary has also, and we've seen that the 2020 primary more so, almost became like a proxy battle between the two sides of the Democratic Party. In 2020, we saw Speaker Nancy Pelosi traveling to the district to campaign for Cuellar, whereas this cycle, we've seen progressive figures like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Senators Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders come to the district to campaign for her. The difference here, though, which I think is fascinating, is that we haven't seen national establishment Democrats like Pelosi campaign or even voice support for Cuellar this campaign cycle. In fact, they've stayed silent on their support for him because I think they realize that to an extent, this is a very tricky situation and potentially a lose-lose situation. Talking to Republican sources in DC, They say they're very excited to challenge either Cisneros or Cuellar because they have someone like Cuellar who is tied to an FBI investigation, and someone like Cisneros who has these very progressive policies, who Republicans say those policies are out of touch in this pretty conservative district.
All right, Julia Manchester from The Hill, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Problems at polling sites slowed down the vote counting process in the state's largest county. Why new rules that aim to make elections more reliable could cause trouble in future elections.